Hello friends, how are you? In this video we will watch 10 of the most famous murder cases in Scotland. A murderer pushed his new bride off a cliff in Edinburgh for insurance. Another shot two families in their beds while burgling their homes. A third woman was publicly hanged for killing her neighbor, who had quarreled with her over some stolen wood. Scotland has had its fair share of gruesome murders, and we've put together this grim gallery describing 10 of them, the oldest dating back to 1696 and the most recent dating back to 1977. 1. Peter Manuel. Born in 1927, Peter Manuel received his first prison sentence when he was just 15 years old for a violent robbery. Manuel's crimes turned deadly in 1956, a few years after he was released from one of his regular prison terms. He killed 17-year-old Anne Nealance and dumped her body on a golf course in the Scottish town of East Kilbride. Initially, he evaded justice for murder thanks to an alibi provided by his father. Later in 1956, Manuel shot sisters Marion Watt and Margaret Brown, as well as Marion's daughter Vivian, in their home. Next, he killed 17-year-old Isabel Cook, and followed that up with another triple murder during a robbery. Peter Smart, his wife Doris, and their 11-year-old son Michael died at the hands of Manuel, shot in their beds. Finally arrested in early 1958, Manuel was tried for 8 murders at the High Court in Glasgow. Sentenced to death, he was hanged in Barlinnie prison in July, and his body was placed in an unmarked grave inside the prison. 2. Ernest Dumoulin. Speaking to a newspaper in 2006, Ernest Dumoulin cast his mind back to an October evening in 1972, when he was just 21 years old. I took Helga in my arms and kissed her passionately. I wanted her to feel that I loved her above everything else, Dumoulin recalls. He may have actually been in love with his 18-year-old German bride, Helga Conrad, but after that romance, he pushed her off a cliff until she fell 100 feet, 30 meters, to her death. The steep cliff in question was part of the Salisbury Rocks, a dramatic geological feature and impressive loom over Edinburgh. Initially, Dumoulin claimed that Helga's death, which came a few days after their wedding, was a terrible accident. But the landlady of the room where the couple was staying found a receipt for a life insurance policy for a huge sum, equivalent today to more than $8 million. The policy was to cover Helga. Dumoulin was tried for the murder of his young bride and found guilty. After spending 16 years in a Scottish prison, Dumoulin moved to Germany, where he apparently became a priest. 3. Captain Kidd. William Kidd may have been born in the Scottish city of Dundee in 1654, although there is some debate about the facts. However, like many Scots, Kidd was not content to spend his days in his native country, and by the late 1680s, he was captain of a ship sailing from New York City. During the 1690s, Kidd ran as a soldier and fought for the English against the French, to protect commercial ships traveling to and from America. He also commissioned English government commissions to eradicate pirates in the Caribbean. In 1696, Kidd sailed to the Indian Ocean on the ship Adventure Galley to track down and destroy pirate ships. But his crew mutinied, and in a fit of rage, he threw a heavy bucket on the gunner's head, killing him. Kidd himself became a victim of the shifting political winds, and was now accused of being a pirate for pirating his works. He was also accused of killing his gunners. Kidd was arrested in Boston and sent to London for trial. In 1701, Kidd was convicted of piracy and murder. He was hanged at Wapping on the Thames, and his body was hung in chains beside the river. 4. Archibald Hall. Glasgow-born Archibald Hall was a notorious butler and serial killer. His first murder occurred in Dumfriesshire, southern Scotland, in 1975 when Hall shot his former lover, David Wright, in the head. Initially, Hall escaped, moving to London, where he worked as a servant for the Scott Elliot family. In December 1977, Hall bragged to waitress Mary Kugel and petty criminal Michael Kiddo that he planned to rob his employers. He then took his friends to Scott Elliot's apartment in Kensington, London. But Mrs. Scott Elliot showed up unexpectedly and was murdered, perhaps suffocated. The three crooks then placed her body in the trunk of Scott Elliott's car. They drugged Mr. Scott Elliott, shoved him into the car as well, and headed to Scotland. There they buried Mrs. Scott Elliott and killed her husband. Hall and Keto then killed Kugel. Finally, with Keto's help, Hall killed his half-brother Donald Hall, apparently on suspicion of sexual crimes. The two subdued Donald with chloroform before drowning him in the bathroom. Police caught the murderous pair near the Scottish coastal town of North Berwick as they prepared to dispose of Donald's body. The two men were sentenced to 4 life sentences each. Hall died in prison in 2002 at the age of 78. 5. Donald Forbes. When Donald Forbes was convicted of drug crimes in 2003 at the age of 68, the court sentenced him to 12 years in prison. He has already spent 40 years of his life behind bars. But it was the crimes Forbes committed before his final stint in prison that were truly shocking. In 1958, Forbes robbed a fish processing plant in Granton, outside Edinburgh. One of the night guards resisted, and Forbes hit him in the head with a bottle, killing the man. For these atrocities, Forbes was sentenced to death at the High Court in Edinburgh. But after a public campaign, the 23-year-old killer's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. After serving less than a dozen years in prison, Forbes was released in 1970. Just 7 weeks later, he killed again, stabbing a man to death. In a fight in a bar. After his conviction, the double killer was sentenced to life imprisonment for a second time. He was freed from that in 1999. And as we saw, 4 years later, he was convicted of drug dealing. This time, he actually spent the rest of his life in prison, dying at the age of 73 in 2008. 6. Patrick Carraher. In the 1930s, Glasgow was plagued by gang conflict. The gang names, the Norman Conks, the Bingo Boys, the Tongues, the Billy Boys, the Sand Toys, may have had a certain devilish appeal, but the violence was very real. Some gangs were actually highly organized and even involved in politics. Worryingly, at some point the Billy Boys opened a branch in Glasgow of the British Union of Fascists, a Hitler party led by dissident politician Sir Oswald Mosley. One of Glasgow's most notorious and violent gangsters was Patrick Carraher. Although he belonged to a respectable blue-collar family, Carraher became involved in a life of crime from an early age, being locked up for the first time when he was just 14 years old. It wasn't just other gang members who fell victim to his hacking and stabbings, it was innocent bystanders as well. Also on the receiving end of violence. But Carraher finally goes further when he kills Private John Gordon in a brawl. At the subsequent murder trial, Carraher attempted to defend himself as mentally ill. Unwashed, Carraher was hanged in Glasgow's Barlinnie prison in 1946. He was 40, of which he spent about 20 behind bars. 7. Mary Timney. It's January 1862, and a man named Lockhart Hanna has just encountered a horrific sight. His sister Anna lies dead at her country home on Carsfad Farm in the Dumfries district of southwest Scotland. Anna has been badly beaten and is not long for this world when her brother finds her. There were 2 blood-stained weapons next to her body, a knife and an iron bar. It was not long before the main suspect was identified. It was Mary Timney, Anna's next-door neighbor. The two had a previous history of quarreling. Even more damning is that eyewitnesses who saw Timney with blood-stained clothes came forward. At the trial, it is revealed that Anna accused Timney of stealing some wood. The jury found Timney guilty after only 30 minutes of deliberation. In a somber tone, the judge, Lord Dias, announced that the murderer should be hanged by the neck on a gallows until she dies. The sentence was to be carried out publicly in Dumfries in 1862 despite a sustained mercy campaign. Mary Timney was the last woman to be publicly hanged in Scotland. 8. Sheila Garvey and Brian Tiffindale. The trial of Sheila Garvey and Brian Tiffindale for the murder of Sheila's husband, Max, caused a sensation in Scotland in 1968. The country was then still in the grip of Protestant conservatives when it came to social mores. So, when the evidence at trial provided details of bizarre sex acts, orgies and nudity, the Scottish public was horrified and appalled. Long queues formed for a place in the public gallery of the High Court in Aberdeen on trial days as early as 3:30 a.m. Brian Tiffindale and Sheila Garvey were conducting an affair which she claimed began at the instigation of her husband. In contrast, Max had an affair with Tiffindale's sister. At trial, the prosecution said Ms. Garvey conspired with Tiffindale to kill Mr. Garvey. She opened the door to the farmhouse where the couple lived, allowing Tiffindale access. She then gave her lover one of her husband's guns, and he shot Max while he was lying on the bed. Tiffindale and Garvey were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. They were released in 1978, with Tiffindale living until 2003 and Garvey until 2014. 9. Harry Burnett. Harry Burnett was just 21 years old in 1963 when he fell in love with Margaret Guyan, a woman 4 years his senior who worked at the same fish processing company as him in Aberdeen. Married with 2 children, Margaret married Thomas Joyan in 1957. But her husband was a sailor and was often away from home, and according to a BBC report, their marriage was loveless. Joyan went so far as to move into the Burnett home in Aberdeen, with her child the youngest accompanies her. Burnett turned out to be a controlling and jealous type who kept his lover under lock and key. Unsurprisingly, Goyan found this intolerable and decided to return to her apparently tolerant husband. Enraged, Burnett got a gun, tracked down Thomas Goyan, and, by his own account, gave him both barrels. Thomas died instantly. At his trial, Burnett pleaded insanity, but was found guilty of murder. Burnett, the last man to be executed in Scotland before the death penalty was abolished across the UK, was hanged. 10. Robert Balfour. Robert Balfour became Lord Balfour v. Lord Burleigh on the death of his father, Robert Balfour, in 1713. As a young man, Balfour v. did something to which his aristocratic parents, his mother, Lady Margaret Melville, greatly objected. He fell in love with a woman below him in the strict Scottish social hierarchy of the time. Balfour's parents responded by sending him abroad. Before his departure, Balfour told his young mistress that if she married in his absence, he would kill her husband. Apparently undeterred by this terrifying threat, the young woman married a school teacher named Henry Stenhouse. When Balfour returned to Scotland in 1707, he sought out Stenhouse and stabbed him in the shoulder. The wound killed the unfortunate man 2 weeks later. Balfour was tried and found guilty of murder in 1709, and was condemned to be beheaded. But Balfour, dressed in his sister's clothes, managed to escape from his cell in Edinburgh prison and hung on his head until his death in 1757.